Yeah, although we started the Torah Devorah last month, I'm going over a relatively quick chazara to bring everybody up to the same place. Again, the Torah Devorah is explaining the 13 midos of Rachamim, but not the ones that are in the Torah, but the ones that are in the Navi Micha. As the Zohar explains, however, the midos that are enumerated in Micha are called the Rachamim Elyonim. They are the upper source for the midos of Moshe Rabbeinu. Therefore, they are actually a higher level, and each one of them does correspond to a midah of Moshe Rabbeinu, the Hashem Kel Racham V'Chanon. And the whole thesis of the Torah Devorah, once again, is what we might call the double emulation. By our imitating God, God imitates us. That's how it works. That essentially Hashem has certain midos, but these midos are not activated, meaning they're midos, they're characteristics God has, but they're not turned on except to the degree that we ourselves mimic that behavior, and that turns them on. So as a result, the Torah Devorah is explaining what each of these 13 midos means, and in terms of Hashem. And after we know what it means in terms of Hashem, we then ask ourselves, what do we do to trigger that particular midah? Now, again, in terms of Kabbalah, let me point out that all of this is only the first chapter of Torah Devorah, and really, it is only imitating one of the spheros. You know, Hashem has 10 spheros, and the whole Sefer is about imitating all 10 of these spheros. The highest sphera is called Keser. Again, I know right now this may not make total sense, but we'll come back to it. And essentially, Perek Aleph of the Sefer Torah Devorah is how we emulate the characteristics of Keser. Now, there will be a bunch of other stuff as well, but it happens to be that the first chapter is Kimat 50% of the whole Sefer. So it is much longer than any other Perek, but we're also going to have emulation of other Sfiros as well. But right now, we're dealing with the 13 Midos, which are Nichlal in the highest Sfira, the Sfira of Keser. So when people will tell you commonly, Torah Devorah is about emulating the 13 midos of Rachamim. So if you want to be pedantic, you tell them, no, it's not. It's about imitating the 10 Sfiros, and the 13 midos of Rachamim are only imitating one Sfira, the Sfira of Keser. And that's pedantic, so I wouldn't necessarily say make a point of that, but to be accurate, that is exactly right. It is only the sphere of Keser. So again, we went over some of these, even last month, but quick review. The first one, Mikel Kamocha, is the notion that God is giving us life, even at the very moment that we're rebelling against Him. The way I emulate it is I show a person love and affection and care, even when they're spitting in my face. Okay. The second one is Nosei Avon, that God is Nosei Avon, God bears our sin. So here, let me remind you that we have three terms for Averos that appear both in the Yud Gimel Midos of Rachamim and in this Micha as well. And that is Nosei, we have Avon, Pesha, Chet, or Chet, Avon, Pesha. The Gemara itself explains that these three different types of sins, Chet refers to inadvertent, accidental sin. Chet. Avon refers to a sin that you do intentionally, but because of a great Yetzer Hara that you have difficulty controlling. An example would be, if I eat non-kosher food and I think it's kosher, that's a Chet. If I eat non-kosher food and I know it's non-kosher, but I'm really hungry, not life-threatening, but I'm really hungry and there's no kosher food, that's called Avon. It's done out of a big taiva. Pesha is the worst sin of all. That's where there's kosher food and there's non-kosher food. And you want to make a statement and you want to choose non-kosher food. That is called Pesha. It's a spiteful sin. It's a sin of rebelliousness. Now, it's an interesting question, actually. It's not so pashut, really. What do we mean? What a person says, I'm going to eat non-kosher food out of spite. Out of spite of whom? Who does he think he's spiting? Meaning, most of the time, he doesn't think he's spiting God. In other words, that's kind of an odd mental construct. I'm going to show God that I don't care about his mitzvahs. That's almost irrational. Most of the time, the person is saying, I don't believe there's God, I don't believe there's a Torah, and I'm going to spite these crazy, old-fashioned Jews. So if you think about it, a lot of sins that are committed out of spite, and there is such a category, indeed, are not really intentional sins against God. In fact, in some way, you could even call it an unintentional sin. I don't believe God exists, I don't believe God gave this mitzvah. So that's an interesting machlokas in halacha even. If we treat a person who doesn't believe in Hashem and is doing something in a spiteful way, do we treat that as a pesha? Or do we actually treat it as a type of shogeg in some ways? So that's an interesting machlokas. The classic case of pesha is a very unusual scenario, frankly. The classic case is, I believe in God and I'm going to show God. But as I say, to try to apply that in a modern situation is kind of almost impossible, although I've come across it. I've come across sometimes the idea that I'm angry at God and I want to show him. You know, Williamsburg, as you know, is a very heavy, I don't mean Williamsburg, Virginia, Williamsburg, Brooklyn, is a very heavily Hasidic neighborhood, mainly Satmar. It's adjacent to Crown Heights. Crown Heights is Chabad, Williamsburg is Satmar, and there's the demilitarized zone between them a little bit. Just be sure you don't cross the street in the wrong time. So there was a chassid who went off the derech, who started a restaurant in the middle of Williamsburg with big neon lights called Treif. It's called Treif. Imagine, you're in Williamsburg, Treif. So again, that's certainly a spiteful act, but once again, is it the pshat he's rebelling against God, or is it the pshat he's rebelling against his upbringing and everything else? Okay. Now, so we do know that in classic Chazal, Avon, Pesha, Chet have distinct meanings. And indeed, in the Yud Gimel Midos of Moshe, we say, Hashem is Nosei Avon, V'Fesha, V'Chata'ah. Right? Because those three different levels. Now, even there you have a little bit of a kasha of the order. Avon, Pesha, Chata'ah. Which order are you going? If you're going in ascending order, from the most lenient to the most chamor, it should say Chata'ah, Avon, Pesha. If you're starting from the worst, it should say Pesha, Avon, Chata'ah. So Avon, Pesha, Chata'ah is a very difficult order, actually. But putting aside the order issue, in the Yud Gimel Midos of Moshe, I'll get to say, in the Yud Gimel Midos of Moshe, they have distinct meanings. For reasons I don't fully understand, however, in the Tomer Devorah's analysis of the Midos of Micha, he does not focus on Avon, Pesha, Chet. He simply uses them generically as terms for sin. So you're not going to see, at least in this parak, you're not going to see the chilukim that are normally given for Yud Gimel Midos of Moshe. Yeah.
Would the Sabbatean or Frankish notion of sinning to bring Mashiach, or however it works there, would that be considered a mitzvah?
Yeah, that could be a situation. Again, as you know, the many of the later Sabbateans, particularly the Frankists, who followed Jacob Frank. See, Jacob Frank was a real problematical guy. I mean, Shabtai Tzvi, the famous false Mashiach, was in all probability simply mentally ill. He probably was paranoid schizophrenic, and he was a brilliant person, and he had some. I mean, please don't. Maybe I shouldn't say this. I don't want to be labeled as a follower of Shabtai Tzvi. I'm certain. I assure you, I'm not. But he was mentally ill, and he could be preyed upon. There were people who took advantage of him to manipulate him in a certain position. He had abilities. In fact, the very fact that he was able to attract people indicates that he had a brilliant mind and a strong personality, but he was frankly nuts. He literally was probably clinically nuts, mentally ill. But some later followers were, quite frankly, very evil. Yaakov Frank, was a guy, total Amoritz, who took over at least part of the movement in Poland, and they were followers of Shabtai Tzvi, but they were Frankists, they were called. And Frank developed the interesting, perverted idea of sin as a way of bringing redemption. Because listen to his argument. His argument was, it says the place where the Baal Tshuva stands is greater than the place of the perfectly righteous. Well, how do we become Baalei Tshuva? We have to sin. We have to sin. So then we do tshuva, and we're closer to God than the perfectly righteous. So he taught sin as a way of coming closer to God. Of course, they never got to the tshuva stage. They just got to the sinning stage. Now, when I say sin, you have to know that this was really, really dark stuff. I mean, of course, we're talking about violating Shabbos, violating kosher. Yeah, of course. But it was even beyond that. We're talking about murder. We're talking about rape. We're talking about incest. We're talking about torture. I mean, we're talking about what you would call actually satanic types of worship. So the Frankists were really, 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 really a bad situation, and that might indeed be classified perhaps as a pesha. Although even there, it's a little complicated, because I'm assuming that although Frank's motives were probably evil, a kind of a cult leader, there may have been some deluded followers who actually thought maybe they were doing something good. You know, it's hard to know, and the like. Okay, so the point I'm making is, though, that the well-known classification of Chet Avon Pesha does not really make its appearance in the Talmud Devorah, and I'm not sure why, but the Ramak is not focusing on that. But so we're just interpreting what is the second midah in the Yud Gimel Midas called Nosei Avon. So he says, when a person does an Aveira, they create a negative malach. They create an evil angel. Just as when you do a mitzvah, you create a virtuous angel, an angel of Kedusha. When you do an Aveira, you create an evil angel. Now, obviously, the power of the angel will depend on the severity of the chet. So we could assume, although he doesn't talk about this, that through a pesha, a more powerful destructive force is created than through a chet, but nevertheless, whether it's chet or in pesha, there is a malach hamashchis. In modern terms, we might describe this destructive angel as negative spiritual energy. There is negative spiritual energy that is created in the world. So it's not just me, so to speak, that suffers, but there is a negative spiritual koach that is dragging the world down. Now, obviously, one single Aveira over billions of people, perhaps the effect might be relatively small, perhaps, but there is an effect. There is a drag down. There is a negative spiritual force. Now, this negative spiritual force needs to be sustained. There is a nutrition. Until that force is destroyed through tshuva, tshuva destroys it. But until that force is destroyed to tshuva, it has to live, meaning God doesn't just destroy the force. The force is a reality that remains in the world. It needs to get nutrition. It needs to live off something. It's like a parasite. It's like a vampire. So quite logically, it should take its life from the sinner. The sinner created it. The sinner's life should be sucked out of him by this negative spiritual force. Now, what that would mean is, I'm not sure. Does that mean he dies? Does that mean he becomes like possessed by a demon? But whatever it is, this negative spiritual force should take him over. So Nosei Avon means that God sustains the negative spiritual force. Now that doesn't sound like such a chesed, right? We would think the bigger chesed is God would destroy it. But God cannot destroy it. Based on the spiritual laws of the universe, until there's tshuva, that spiritual force has to remain. But what God does is, God will sustain it instead of it taking the life force away from you. Now, what that, once again, could mean in psychological terms is that a person commits an aveira. If they would truly understand what they have done in the world, they would be crushed, they would be debilitated, they would be so despondent that they would not be able to go on. So by Hashem carrying the sin, meaning the negative spiritual force created by the sin, that gives me a certain degree of obliviousness to what I've done. And paradoxically, in order to do tshuva, now again, if you're totally oblivious, you're not going to do tshuva, you don't think you did anything wrong. But interestingly enough, the Ramak may be suggesting here that in order to do tshuva, I need to be partially oblivious as to what I've really done in the world. Because if I would be fully aware, I would be crushed. And therefore, Nosei Avon is the chesed of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that we're not fully aware of what we did. We're aware enough that I know I have to do tshuva, but by not being fully aware, I can believe that tshuva is possible. And therefore, it's a great chesed that Hashem does not allow me to feel the full brunt of the pain that I cause Hashem, that I cause the world, that I cause other people, in Ben Adam L'Chaveiro, and the like. Now remember that the first time the expression of carrying an avon appears, it actually appears in the Chumash, after Cain killed Hevel. So Cain prays to Hashem, and Cain says, Gadol avoni minaso. My sin is greater than I can bear. So think about the picture here. There's a certain picture the Torah is communicating. The sin is like a weight, like an albatross, like a huge, huge burden on your shoulders. It bends you over. You can't move. You can't go forward. See how the physical metaphor is describing the inner spiritual turmoil of a person. I murdered, in Cain's case. I destroyed life. How can I go on? And Nosei Avon is God bears at least some of the burden so that you can go on. Because it's important to go on. You know, many of you have heard of Rav Aryeh Levin, the Tzaddik of Yerushalayim. Rav Aryeh Levin, there's a famous book, Tzaddik in Our Time, that is circulating around here. You can always see it. Rav Aryeh Levin was Rav Elyashiv's son-in-law. Even though very, very different personalities, Rav Aryeh Levin was Dafka always involved in chesed and the like. Rav Elyashiv was also did a lot of chesed, but Rav was more masmid, who was private. But one of the many things Rav Aryeh Levin did, this is the years before the State of Israel, when Israel was under a British mandate, is he would visit the Jewish prisoners, because many, many Jews, most of them not religious, were taken prisoner by the British because they were part of Menachem Begin's Irgun, or whatever it is. Some of them were hung, some of them were literally killed, and the like. Many of them were involved in, I don't want to say the word terrorist activity, but involved in violent activities against the British, the bombing of the King David Hotel, and the like. And the British prison in Jerusalem was in the Russian compound. You know where the Russian compound is? And you can actually see, I think there's even, I haven't been there for like 30 years, but there used to be a museum of a prison, probably still there, and the like. So he would visit the prisoners and give them comfort and give them nechama and give them chizuk. He was known as the Rav of the prisoners. Most of them were not religious at all, in any way. So at one time, there was actually a prisoner there, very, very rare, who was not there for political reasons. He literally was a murderer. He was a Jewish guy who just killed somebody, killed another Jew. They got into a fight. Right? It's very rare because he wasn't killing out of a revolt against the British. He just killed somebody. And the person was a Jew. He wasn't a criminal and he wasn't a murderer, but as scary as it is, he just lost his temper. It's so frightening how far anger could take him. And he killed somebody in his anger. Now, if you would ever imagine, God forbid, if you ever imagine how you would feel, how we would feel, if in a moment of uncontrollable anger we did that, we would have a great deal of difficulty just living. Just living. I mean, what did I do? So you could imagine the person was totally broken, devastated. He saw no reason to live. He wanted to commit suicide, which would have added an Aveira on top of this Aveira. So Rav Aryeh spent a lot of time giving him chizuk. And the chizuk was this. The chizuk was not the soft pedal. He says, listen, this is an Aveira, which is like the worst Aveira. I mean, it's one of the worst possible Aveiras that a human being could ever do. And your whole life you have to have remorse and do tshuva. But that doesn't mean that the rest of your life can't be something good. You can still do mitzvahs. You still daven to Hashem. You put on tefillin. You keep Shabbos. Your mitzvahs mean something. Don't have the attitude that because of such a monumental failure, that all of your life has to be a failure. You still do the good that you can do, and Hashem in His rachamim will count that. That's a very important idea. So essentially what Rav Aryeh was doing is Rav Aryeh was helping the person not to be so overwhelmed by his guilt that he wouldn't be able to go on. In fact, they tell a similar story with the Vilna Gaon, in which the Vilna Gaon, it's interesting, was thrown into prison several times in his life. It's an interesting story, exactly why. When the Vilna Gaon was a younger man in his 30s, he went into Golus. He actually traveled around anonymously because he felt Golus was a kapara for sin, so he would actually go from place to place as an anonymous beggar. And of course, different stories how his identity got known. According to one story, there was a math problem in some university that the professors couldn't solve, and the Vilna Gaon somehow got there and he solved it for them. And the Vilna Gaon's family name was Kramer, so I think there's something in trigonometry called a Kramer parallelogram or something. I don't know what it is, but they say there's some story that is connected to the Vilna Gaon making some discovery. But in Europe in those days, you needed papers to go anywhere. Even to go from city to city, you needed some type of paper, some type of authorization, visas, passports, whatever they called it. And he didn't have anything on him. So there were times that he was thrown in jail. He was thrown in jail, which he considered to be part of his kapara. So the story goes, similar to Rav Aryeh, he was thrown into prison with a Jew who was guilty of murder. I don't mean any political murder, just violent murder. And the guy was not from. In fact, it didn't even bother the guy. Very different type of murderer. Rav Aryeh was dealing with a Reitzeach who essentially was a good person, who just had an anger problem. The Vilna Gaon is dealing with a violent person who doesn't care. So, big guy, etc. So they bring in water to the Vilna Gaon and bread, and the Vilna Gaon is washing his hands, and he notices that the guy is just taking the bread and about to eat it. So he says to the guy, he says, you got to wash the Netilas Yadayim before you eat bread. So the guy starts laughing. The guy, is big guy, I don't have a picture of him, but big, muscular guy. And he shows the Vilna Gaon his big hands, and he says, these are hands that break necks. These are hands that crush people. You think God is going to care if I wash them before I eat bread? The hands of a murderer? He was almost boasting. So the Vilna Gaon told him, he says, what does one have to do with the other? You're certainly going to get a lot of Gehenim for Ritzicha, that's for sure. But just because you're a murderer, that doesn't make you putter from the Netilas Yadayim. He says, what does one have to do with the other? He says, you think, it's like, come leibich rabamine, right? You get the bigger part. You think that because you're guilty of murder, you don't have to wash your hands before you eat bread? He says, so again, the Vilna Gaon was a little tougher than Rav Aryeh. Rav Aryeh had maybe a sweeter touch, but of course that's because the Rotseach was different in the two cases. But the message is the same. The message is the same. That just because I do Averis doesn't mean I shouldn't do mitzvahs. And this is an important message in a lot of areas. I get situations with intermarried couples, situations with gay people. I mean, it comes up in many, many, many different situations where, for whatever reason, a person is not yet in a place where they can separate from a serious Aveira. Whatever the reason, right or wrong. But that doesn't mean can't keep Shabbos, can't keep kosher, can't wear tefillin, can't daven. Right? Someone's in a gay relationship, chas v'shalom. Of course, they're halachically obligated to get out of that. But let's assume they're not going to get out of it. So sometimes the attitude is, well, what's the point of my putting on tefillin if I'm doing this? The answer is, just because you're doing this doesn't mean you can't do that. And the same thing in every situation. There's no reason why a person who's married to a non-Jewish spouse cannot make Kiddush on Friday night. Right? Kiddush is Kiddush, and intermarriage is intermarriage. One is bad and one is good. But just because you're doing something bad doesn't mean you can't do something good. Right? So all of that is nichlal in Nosei Avon, that God kind of relieves us of the burden of our sin, because that gives us the chizuk, and that gives us the ability to be able to go on. Meaning, you need a certain amount of obliviousness, because otherwise you get overwhelmed. And when you get overwhelmed, you get paralyzed. Now, like anything else, all gifts of Hashem can be misused. Sometimes we can use the obliviousness to not care enough to change. That's a classic example of using a chesed of Hashem in violation of Hashem. The chesed of letting you not feel so bad is that you'll have the energy to do tshuva. If you use that chesed to simply ignore the situation, then you're literally taking Hashem's gift and you're spitting it in his face. You're using the very gift that he gave you, just like life. That goes back to the first midah, against him. By the way, it's interesting that the Or HaKadosh actually uses this notion of obliviousness in a totally opposite way. Fascinating. The Or says, Hashem does not allow our neshama, our conscious selves, to feel the pleasure of our neshama when we learn Torah. See, the Devorah is talking about partial obliviousness of sin. The Or is saying there's a partial obliviousness of the joy our neshama gets when we learn Torah. He says the following: if we would consciously feel what our neshama experience, our spiritual essence experiences, when we learn Torah, we could never stop. We couldn't stop. That means we would die of starvation. We would die of lack of sleep. We couldn't. It's like the strongest addiction you could imagine. I cannot tear myself away. But then I'm going to die. Hashem wants me to live. So how does Hashem let me live? By not letting me feel the pleasure, the pure pleasure of what the neshama is markish. An amazing thing. Baruch Hashem. Hopefully we feel some pleasure. That's a good thing. And the Chazon Ish, by the way, has a remarkable essay which is written out of his experience. He describes what it's like to learn 12 hours straight without interruption. And I have to admit, I have never been zocha to that, not even near it. But the Chazon Ish apparently, did it more than once. In fact, probably did it every day, on some level. And he describes the exponential effect. He says it kind of takes 3 hours. We don't even it takes 3 hours of uninterrupted till you really get into it. And then he discusses levels after levels after level. What it is, the 6th hour, is like many times more than what it was after 5 hours. Till you reach a level almost of Ruach HaKodesh, of Nevuah, of ecstasy. Now this is all describing what you feel consciously. And then you factor in the Or that we only feel a tiny fraction of what the neshama feels. You can imagine how amazing all of this is. In fact, I think Mir has a program of 10 hours straight. I think Nassan Tzvi, Zichrono Livracha, created a special program. It's not for everybody, but it's by admission only, by invitation only, or whatever, of people who commit themselves to learn 10 hours uninterrupted, with no stop whatsoever. And I don't know how many people are in it, but it's it's kind of an elite program within Mir. I don't want to push it, but no reason why Or Sameach couldn't do that too. I mean, listen, what's stopping us? But okay, but this is what it is, and so it's interesting that we need oblivion in life, both for the good and for the bad. We need to be a little oblivious of the sin, so we're not crushed and we can do tshuva. And we need oblivion of the good sometimes, because otherwise we wouldn't stop. And if we wouldn't stop, we would die. And Hashem wants us to live, therefore we can't feel the full pleasure of the neshama as we're learning Torah. Okay, so that's the midah of what is called Nosei Avon. How do we emulate it? Once again, the notion of not rubbing it in, meaning somebody hurt me. Remember, this is pre-tshuva. He didn't do tshuva yet, but I don't constantly have to remind him of what he did. I remember, if I could use a law school analogy, whatever. There was, in law school and contracts course. So there's a famous, it's famous only because every law school in the United States teaches this as a case. It's a case about a guy that promised his mother-in-law a house, and he broke the contract, and whatever it is. So the court analyzes what you need, and she won the case. So the judge, in the middle of the case, has some words for a son-in-law who cheats his mother-in-law, who was so devoted to him, and he says, what type of ingrate does it? So I remember there's like a supplementary note after the case that says that the woman lived for another 15 years, and her favorite recreation, she got the house, right? Her son-in-law tried to get her out of the house. She got the house. Her favorite recreation was she would sit in the rocking chair, and she would read out loud every night all the things that the judge said about her son-in-law. You're an ingrate, ungrateful guy, selfish. She would cackle. She would read all of these stories. So her whole avodah, her whole cheshik in life at this point, I'm not blaming her, but was to rub it in. So he says, rub it in means that even when you give somebody musar and you give somebody tochah and you got to discuss it, don't rub it in. Say things like, you had a bad day. Life is tough. We do make mistakes. So it's not ignoring, but it's a sense of not making the person bear the full weight of it. Because for keret, if you want the person to ask mechila, and you want the person to do tshuva, and you want the person to improve, if you kind of dump on him in a very excessive way, then one of two things are going to happen. Either what's going to happen is he'll be so crushed, depressed, that he can't even talk to you. Or what's going to happen is he's going to get so angry that he won't want to talk to you. Right? So Nosei Avon is this bechina that don't put the full weight of the sin on the sinner, carry some of the weight. So he shouldn't be crushed by the burden. Now, this is reminiscent a little bit of the two lavin in the Torah, loy sikaim v'loy sita, right? There are two lavin in Parshas Kedoshim. One is, you shall not take revenge, and the other is, you shall not bear a grudge. So Rashi, based on the Gemara in Kedushin, says, what is the difference between taking revenge and bearing a grudge? So it's a Gemara, Rashi brings it. The Gemara gives an example. If I ask you, lend me your axe or lend me a tool, and you say no, the next day you ask me to borrow something. So it depends. If I say, hey, I'm not lending you anything because you didn't lend me, that is called taking revenge. Taking revenge. Meaning I'm doing to you what you did to me, I'm taking revenge. But what if I say, sure, I will lend it to you because I'm a much better person than you. Unlike you, who didn't lend me something, I'm going to lend you something. That's a lav too. That's bearing a grudge. Now, it's interesting, which means I'm dumping on you. It's interesting, though, there is an interesting machlokes. Is there a prohibition to bear a grudge in your heart? Meaning, what is the aveira of bearing a grudge? Is the aveira of bearing a grudge that I'm telling you that I'm better than you, so I'm making you feel bad? what if, for example, you asked me, and after you didn't give me something, I lend you something, and I smile and I'm nice and I don't even mention it. I don't make you feel bad at all. But in my heart, I'm thinking to myself, what a bum. When I asked him yesterday, he said no. Wow. So that's an interesting machlokas. There are some Rishonim that learn that the Isser of Netira is predicated on the burden you're putting on the other person, that you're hurting the other person by reminding him that he was selfish. Unless you're doing it b'derech tochacha. See, that's an interesting issue. Because what if I'm telling him because I want him to do tshuva? That's a separate issue. But if I'm doing it out of anger or resentment, that's called a grudge. So if the Isser is I'm making him feel bad, then as long as I don't make him feel bad, I'm okay. But some say that the Isser is a midah of the leg, which is much, much harder to get over. So that's a big machlokes. It seems that the Talmud Devorah, at least, he doesn't mention Lo Sitor, but his description of Nosei Avon would tend to emphasize not dumping on the person, as opposed to what you feel internally and the like. But again, it's not a raya because he's not talking about the Lo Sitor. Okay. Alrighty, so these are the first two midas, Mikel Kamocha, Nosei Avon. So tomorrow we'll continue with the third midah, which is called Over al Pesha. Once again, the Ramak is not going with the Mahalech of Avon is different than Pesha. He is simply not going there. He is looking at all of these terms as synonyms for Averos, and each one will have its own midah as we go through it.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.